I was also attracted to the aspect of traveling. So, this was an opportunity to see the world, have adventures, and, earn this title so I could reap the benefits of that later on. I ended up getting deployed to Iraq, which I was very excited about, and I went there in June of 2003. I had no idea that we had just laid siege to Fallujah that past April, just unaware of what was going on in Iraq. Based on what they had told us in boot camp and based on whatever preconceived notions I had about Iraq and Iraqis, I had this idea that there would be unambiguous bad guys and then good guys, and I could save the good guys from the bad guys. I would be a hero, and it would be exactly this simple. But it wasn't. As soon as I got there, I could see there was this entire spectrum of attitudes amongst Iraqis towards us, and it just wasn't going to be that simple. And I was deeply uncomfortable right away having to look these people in the eye and tell them that this is for your own good. It all kind of came to a head in November of 2004 when my unit got called into the second siege of Fallujah. I think arguably one of the bloodiest and most brutal operations of the entire occupation. We only have one estimate of the civilian death count, and the numbers are between 4,000 and 6,000 people might have been killed in this. The city once had a population between 300 and 4,000 people. It was a large city, and it was leveled to the ground. I think one study I heard said that an entire third of the city was completely leveled. A second third had major structural damage, and then the final third just had minor damage to it. Everyone living in the city, except for military-age males who were forced to stay in the city, did not have the option to flee no matter what their affiliations might have been with insurgent groups. They had to stay in the city. Everyone else was forced to leave under bombardment. And I remember feeling deeply uncomfortable about being part of this. Yet everyone around me was so sure that we were doing the right thing. We were fighting Al-Qaeda. This was the official story. Everyone kept making reference to Hue City in Vietnam. This battle of Fallujah was going to be historic, like the Battle of Hue City. We were going to live in Marine Corps history as heroes and be celebrated. I felt very alone and unsure of what my gut was telling me. And I remember, as we were in the middle of the city, going house to house, fighting insurgents, entering into people's houses and seeing photo albums on the coffee tables and flipping through those and seeing what looked to me like a pretty normal life. Birthday parties, weddings. Meanwhile, everyone else was looting silverware and anything of value out of the house. And it went on like this for about 2 weeks. The entire time I'm sort of just ambivalent, not really knowing what to think or what to do about this, yet participating nonetheless. So we come out of Fallujah to nothing short of a hero's welcome. There were journalists around us constantly. A lot of the people from my unit, when they went to their hometowns, actually had parades thrown in their honor. All kinds of authors were writing us, asking for interviews, for books. And anecdotally, I have one interesting story. This guy, Gary Livingston, wrote a book about my unit's role in the operation. It's called Fallujah with Honor, the Role of the 1st Battalion 8th Marines, something like that. So I was actually being punished at this particular moment because I was getting kind of lippy with my command. But I was in the barracks hut on barracks duty when he called me to do an interview with me. And he was asking about this one particular incident where it was the first casualty of the operation. I was with a lieutenant. We were up on a roof in the center of the city and got shot by a sniper and he died. And he was asking me for details about this. I was like, well, he got shot by a sniper and he died. And there really wasn't much more to it than that. It was just, it's just what it was. But he kept digging for details, and I got the impression he was looking for something juicy. And I said to him, well, if you want juicy stories, I have these. I have stories about people desecrating bodies. I have stories about people looting houses. My gunnery sergeant tried to get me killed. I have that story. I can tell you that. I watched us bulldoze entire neighborhoods to the ground. I've got stories if you want others. He said to me quite frankly, he said, look, the title of this book is Fallujah with Honor. I'm not looking for these kinds of stories. So at that point, I started to understand that the telling of this story was about as important as the military operation itself, that this was going to live on in some way, and not in the way that I had anticipated it. And the other irony of this is that when I went home, I got the hero's welcome that I always wanted. Yet, at this point, knowing what I participated in, and others not knowing the full reality of that, it was deeply uncomfortable for me. So at that point, I started to really try to educate myself about what happened. I tried to, over the course of a few years, as I fully started to understand the context of this operation, exactly how wrong it was, exactly how much we were lied to, I started to get involved in anti-war work, first at Boston University, where I was an undergrad at the time, and eventually I formed an organization called the Justice for Fallujah Project. And you know, we had speaking events, film screenings, raising awareness to as much as we could. Yet I had the hardest time speaking to people from my old unit. They were very angry about this new path that I took, and you know, me trying to understand what we participated in deeply. A lot of them stopped speaking with me. And like I've had this sort of driving question ever since, like how is it possible that we witnessed the exact same thing and came out of this with such different understandings about what we participated in? The only thing I can come up with is just we understood the context of it a little differently, or maybe I was willing to ask certain questions that they weren't, I don't know. So all of these projects that I got involved with, first the Justice for Fallujah Project, later with Cali, the East Law Reparations Project, and we can talk more about that later. I kind of started this project of trying to compile documentation and to try to tell a different kind of story about these operations, to raise awareness, but also to sort of deflate the mythology that was built around the so-called Battle of Fallujah, more properly a siege of Fallujah, a sacking of the city. Which has led pretty linearly to this project, the Sacking of Fallujah, People's History. It just came out a couple weeks ago. And the reason it's a people's history and not a military history or a more conventional history is because of this immense amount of propaganda that was told about this operation, because it was so intentionally made a media spectacle. A media spectacle not to distract or to entertain in any sense, but to achieve military goals, because there were policies in place called information operations intended to achieve military goals. And we argue in this book that the propaganda, it's not an ancillary effort to the military operations, it's constitutive of the violence itself. It shapes the violence and it motivates the violence. So, central to these information operations was silencing Iraqis, silencing their experiences and their perspective and their voices. So this book is an effort to lend a platform to our war victims and to try to let them tell the story as much as possible on their terms. Ever since I participated in this, I felt a responsibility to do this. I tell my story to raise awareness about this, not because I think my story is particularly enlightening or interesting. I feel, to me, this is an act of reparations. At the very least, I owe this because I helped destroy the city, because I knew better too, and I didn't do anything about it. So, yeah, I guess that's it.
My fear is that responsibility in my family was defined as the ability to act, and that the increasing amount of your capacity to act increases your moral responsibility to do so. So, in spite of the attempts by many of the people in this room to stop the Iraq War and to engage in ending sanctions before 2003 and after, to try and prevent the military operations there, started to develop a theory about what just action actually looks like. Because the idea of bearing witness didn't seem quite sufficient. The idea marching and protest didn't seem sufficient, but also the idea that there is such a thing as an innocent victim. Because for me, it would have been very easy to say, I'm part of the longer history of the diaspora, I'm not responsible, my complicity doesn't count because I too am a victim of the system. And I think that many of us can find ways out of our obligations by imagining ways that we're victims of a bigger system. So the idea of taking personal responsibility for the violation of a country that was also supposed to be my own country was a big political step. The ISLA reparations project was something else first. I think we called it agape or some love thing, which is fine too. But the idea was that we would like to see the US government pay reparations to the Iraqi people, but also that government-oriented reparations would be using the master's tool to destroy the master's house. So the idea that broad-scale government quantitative distribution of aid would be any different than broad-scale quantitative massive distribution of weapons was a little bit problematic for me. So we started working on a grassroots reparations campaign, which asked people to be personally responsible for the irreparable damage that the Iraq War in 2003 was causing. At the time, we didn't talk about sanctions or the 90s or before that. So as I worked with my mom, with Ross, with other people to gather a collection of people of conscience from the United States and Europe, we also started to find dilemmas in the concept of grassroots reparations. So one of the dilemmas is that of moral self-indulgence. So it's very easy to try to imagine ourselves as doing a good thing and that it's the right thing and that there are no problems with it. So there are lots of people participating in this project of gathering support and believing that by going to Iraq or going to a refugee camp or giving money or starting a program that this would somehow absolve us, or that it would end, or that our responsibilities would somehow diminish over time. There was a really wonderful man who challenged us. My mom and I had asked, we'd like to work directly with Iraqi people. We'd like to take a year off work in school, and we'd like to go be there, whatever that means, on the ground, so to speak. And he posed a challenge to us, which was, I'm not sure you're worth your plane ticket, and he was right, but I have a case for you. If you can keep this girl alive for a year, then I'll tell you the best way to get there, whatever that meant. And the case he handed us was of a young woman who had a rare blood disorder, and the United Nations couldn't afford her treatment. It was considered a long-term treatment that they didn't handle, and she had come to a refugee camp in Jordan, and until she could be resettled to another country, would slowly die. And it was an extremely expensive medication. We had to raise something like $30,000 in a year. And starting from nothing as a high school student and a single mother, it wasn't exactly easy, but our community came together and we did it. And she now lives in Germany. But the challenge that we might not be worth our plane ticket is an important one, and it always nags at me, especially as I flew here, that our presence isn't always a gift, and that our efforts are sometimes more an imposition than they are actually beneficial to people. I later ended up living in a refugee camp with my mom in Jordan and started a very intimate long-term relationship with a network of many Iraqis, some of whom are my relatives, some of whom are friends, and some of whom I've never actually met in person, but we've managed to move mountains together, in part because of the enduring, lifelong commitment to solidarity that is slow and complicated and morally problematic. And that brought me to a second dilemma of reparations, which is that they have to be mutual. So the idea that you want to give reparations because you feel like your country or you did something wrong is great. But someone on the other end has to want it. Otherwise, it's just yet another imposition of moral quandary. So in the course of my last decade working with Iraqi people, there have been many times where I found myself wanting to be an ambassador to the people who've pooled resources and spent a lot of energy and been very emotionally and morally moved to engage in the reparations work that we do. And yet, on the ground, sometimes people just want the thing itself. So it's often an imposition to try and describe the moral framework that reparations is to someone who may just want the aid or may just want revenge. For example, there was a young child who had a very severe birth defect and was maybe weeks away from dying. He was completely blue. And a lot of people pooled emergency resources and really tapped into the very little money that they had and were really emotionally moved to engage in this emergency situation. He was moved to a hospital in India that was willing to perform his surgery, a corrective heart surgery, and then flew back. And since then, people have been working really hard to get him into the right school and keep a relationship with him. But his family didn't care at all about the moral quality of the money that was going to send them this child's health care. They just wanted his surgery, and it didn't matter where it came from. It didn't matter if I was a missionary trying to save their child's soul or if I was motivated by greed. They didn't care at all. And so that was not actually a reparations project because it wasn't mutual. There wasn't a mutual recognition that reparations was important. So sometimes it fails, and that's okay. The third lesson that I've learned so far, and I present these dilemmas not to say that we shouldn't be participating in reparations. This is something I believe in and have committed my life to, but that we should always be uncomfortable with ourselves, and I think that's good, is that when we ask for justice, we might get it. So reparations is the kind of justice that makes perpetrators of violence really happy because it marks history, it often quantifies harm, and it's very often used as a tool to absolve people of a future engagement with responsibility, but it's not the only form of justice. Sometimes people want revenge. Sometimes they want other things, and so if you're coming forward offering reparations, you might be met with some really important resistance. I was so honored to spend a very long period of time with a farmer named Hamid, who brought me during my dissertation research to and from his farmland to talk to me about the toxicity of the soil and the air and his crops. And I had talked to him about reparations, and we'd spent some time talking about what reparations ethnography might be. And he really turned me on to the idea of revenge ethnography. He said, you know, telling stories, bearing witness by telling stories is okay, but don't you want to make Americans suffer just a little bit? Don't you want them to cry or be angry or feel something uncomfortable? And I said, yeah, I think, yeah, we want that too. The precondition Hamid set for me to do research with him was what he called revenge. So he was not interested in the idea of reparations as an accounting for the irreparable. He was interested in, rather than balancing the possibilities for repair, balancing harm. So Hamid was someone who felt that his body was toxic and radioactive, and that he would love to be buried in the United States to sort of spread the joy. He was just a very clever guy, I liked him a lot. And his first test for me was to offer me dates from his plantation. And I have a Geiger counter app on my phone. It's not very accurate, but it's enough to check. And he said, run the Geiger counter over my dates. He had faced really heavy bombardment in his land and had seen a lot of toxic waste over the last decades, not just the last battle. And the Geiger counter went off. Food was radioactive for sure. And he said, eat it. This is what we're going to be eating. If you want to be with me, this is what we're going to be eating, and we're going to be drinking water, and this is the kind of daily saturation. And if you want to be in solidarity, the condition is this. And it didn't seem quite like revenge to me, but the fact that he called it that was important, because what it meant is that sometimes the justice that we are trying to offer isn't the justice that's being asked of us to perform, and that our own bodies and our own suffering are at stake, and we don't get to absolve ourselves, not only by, like me, I could have absolved myself as saying I'm equally a victim of the system, But we also don't get to absolve ourselves through the process of reparations. We're always entrenched, we're always stuck. And so these are lifelong commitments, as many of you know. So those are some dilemmas in the underlying philosophy of the work that we're doing. And I guess I would just conclude with one final statement, as I realize how depressing what I just said is, that we also are not allowed, in spite of not being absolved, we are also not allowed to be paralyzed by the idea that we should be perfect. So grappling with our imperfect actions and the kind of moral precarity that we put ourselves in by taking action is better than doing nothing. So I hope I didn't discourage you from giving reparations, even as I hope I did. If that makes sense. Okay.
Hello, and thank you for being here. My name is Feurat Alani. I'm a French Iraqi or Iraqi French. I was born in France in 1980, where the war between Iran and Iraq started. My father left Iraq in 1972. He was an opponent to the regime. And it was unusual for Iraqis at that time to go to France. And I'm saying that because I was born with the idea that I was a mix between France and Iraq, and I was fascinated by my parents' country, but I didn't know anything about it. And so as a kid, I was always asking questions to my father, who would not say much. But one day he saw me very sad, because I had a lot of friends around visiting their family, and we didn't have any family. I didn't have any cousin, uncles in France. So as I asked him the question, I said, do we have a family like my friends have? And he looked at me, he took a piece of paper and he started to write names, many names, almost 100. And he gave me the paper, a piece of paper, and he said, this is your family. And so I took the paper and I saw names that I've never heard about before. And it was like a treasure for me, and I kept it in my pocket for many years. Until '89, when the war between Iran and Iraq stopped, and we had the chance to go to Iraq. Not my father, but my mother and my sister. My father, I feel now, had the feeling, I guess, that it was urgent. He knew that this only year of peace would be very short. And so we went there, and I went there with many ideas and cliches about Iraq. I thought as a kid that Iraq was a very faraway country, full of camels, sands, and nothing else. And I discovered a very modern country with highways, American cars, Japanese cars, and I was amazed by this country. And I was only 9 years old, so my insight at that time was about what I could eat there, what I would do with my family, and my first memories about Iraq are an apricot ice cream, and it's very important for me because this is the only very strong memory I have from that Iraq that was in peace. So we spent 2 months there, amazing month, and I came back to France with a lot of stories to tell to my friends. And then suddenly in 1990, another war started when Iraq invaded Kuwait. We also had the chance to go to Iraq after the war, during the embargo, and I saw a totally different country. I saw it was the beginning for me of the chaos in Iraq. It was a new chapter for me, as I already started to chase this Iraq that I dreamed of, and this Iraq that I've seen in '89. Then we went back to France, and I went back to Iraq many times during the embargo until '95, where I saw the country collapsing. I saw the social and economical misery being in place. And in '95 I was 15 years old, and I was really sad and tired of witnessing this, and I decided to stop to go to Iraq. I wanted to have a break, and I wanted to stay away of all this misery that was too much for me. But then suddenly, after many years of avoiding it, Iraq came back to me when the Bush administration started to talk about a war that was going to happen after 9/11. And I remember clearly the night of the 19 March 2003, when the first bombs fell on Baghdad. Again, I wanted to escape, and I refused to watch TV like with my parents. I refused to assist to the first destruction of Iraq. So I escaped. I went in the metro. I took a metro inside Paris, just wandering all night to avoid it. And that's when a woman came into the metro. We were only 3 people inside, and she said, she had a mic with her, and she said that she would sing for Iraq, for the women and children of Iraq. And so I was shocked. I was happy and sad at the same time, and I took it as a sign, and I decided to go back to Iraq. But how? I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I would not lie and say that I wanted to be a reporter when I was a kid. But I realized that going to Iraq and coming back to France, telling stories to my friends, was actually being a reporter. I was already telling stories and describing the country. So I went to journalism school, and I went to Iraq. I went back there in 2004, just before the Battle of Fallujah, where Ross was. And I started to do my job and to tell stories again about war and all the violence that happened during those years. I wanted to stay 6 months, and actually I stayed 5 years, from 2003 until 2008, so I witnessed all the violence that spread into Iraq through the battles of Fallujah, through the militia war between Sunni and Shia militias. I had the opportunity to follow some US soldiers during operations as well. So I was in what we call the red zone with the Iraqis and the green zone with the Americans. So I had the feeling that I had many stories to tell. But then, with the years going on, I decided to leave Iraq. I came back to France. And that's when, in 2015, we had a huge explosion in Paris with the Islamic State claiming this tragic event. And I've witnessed on TV, on the newspaper, on social media, a lot of cold analysis about Iraq. Only one side of the story, figures, death, violence, only the dark side of that war. And this is when I decided to tell the other side, to tell all the memories that I had in mind, and I didn't have the chance to express while I did my job as a reporter. and most of the, how can I say, most of the figures and most of the cold analysis were on Twitter. And so I decided as a provocation to tell a long story on Twitter, a very intimate approach about Iraq, basically just opening the door to my family to give another picture, a human face of the war. So I started with 10 tweets, then 20, then 30, and I had a lot of messages of people from France, from all over the world asking me to give more details, to really give a profound insight of this Iraq. And that's when I ended up writing more than 1,000 tweets, going on from '89, the first time I went to Iraq, until 2011, when the US Army withdrew from Iraq. And with the colleagues that were following the tweets, we decided to do something bigger. That is a book, a graphic novel, with the tweets, and animated documentary called Flavors of Iraq. It's called Flavors of Iraq because in that story I talk a lot about senses, about smells, tastes of a country that is depicted only through the prism of violence. And so my aim with this is just to humanize the conflict, and to give the other version that is very difficult to find. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Armstrong, and I hadn't planned, Mitch, on talking about how I came to volunteer to embed over in Iraq, but when you brought that up, it strikes me that maybe that's a good place to start. So thanks to George, and thanks to Olivia, and Kat, and Max, and Mitch for having us tonight, and thank you to everybody for such a compelling panel. I'm the Forrest Gump of the war on terror. I start by saying that because I had no business embedding. When Mitch asked that question, it kind of struck me as a humbling question, because there's a part of me that doesn't want to tell you how little I knew before I landed in Iraq. In 2007, I had a friend who was in a SEAL unit, and my embed began in a conversation with him over the telephone, in which he told me that he was going to be in Haditha for his next assignment and deployment. And I told him, I would love to see what you guys are doing over there. And he said, well, why don't you come over? I said, you think we could make that happen? He said, well, it's a wild idea, Eat Boy. That was his nickname for me. I was Eat Boy. He was Diet. We were studying opposites growing up. He said, it's a wild idea, Eat Boy. Let's see. So I tried to put together an application to our hometown newspaper. I grew up in Winchester, Virginia, birthplace of Patsy Cline. Patsy Cline's mom was my babysitter. Small world. And I knew the editor of that paper, Tom Burton, and I told him I had a story in mind. Sort of local boy makes good. You know, here was this SEAL platoon, and here was the leader of this SEAL platoon, and I wanted to go over to Haditha to tell the story. Tom Burton liked the idea, but when I tell you Winchester's a small town, I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that. Tom Bird was a patient of my father's. And when he came in for his checkup, about a week after he agreed to sponsor my trip to Iraq, my father, who was not wild about his son going to Iraq, reminded Tom that his son was not a journalist at all. This was what my father was always telling me, as I was telling him about my desire to go over there. You're not a journalist, Matt. You're not a journalist. He said to Tom Bird the same thing, and Tom Bird, without explaining to me how this happened, called me the next night and told me I would not be going to Iraq. He just said, we can't take the risk on you, Matt. You've never been in a war zone before. And I said, Tom, it's a catch-22. Somebody's got to take the risk on me at some point, or I'll never be in a war zone. He's like, well, yeah, it's not going to be us. So, kind of like Ross talks about, this became a story of me wanting to prove myself to be a tough guy. I wanted to prove to my friend and to my father and to myself that I was a man. And I was teaching at a historically black college at the time, and we had some resources, and I decided I was going to build a scholarly journal with a friend of mine, and I was going to use that scholarly journal to get to Iraq. And I did it. I did it. I got over there, and again, coming back to the Forrest Gump of the war on terror, here's how little I knew. When I landed in Iraq, I got put in a press pool with a real journalist, Moni Basu, at CNN. And as soon as I got into the pool with Moni, she started grilling me like a good journalist should. She asked me where I was from. I told her North Carolina A&T, the historically black college, where the journal was coming out of it. She said, oh, so you know about the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed story, right? And I said, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's that? The guy who started the war you're here to cover. You know? I knew nothing. I didn't know that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's entire exposure to America took place in my own backyard, at the very school that I was teaching at. Yet there I was in Kuwait, getting ready to go to Iraq. It terrified me to realize how little I knew. So I got on that C-130 Hercules, did the lights out, nosedive into Baghdad, knowing I knew nothing, and I started taking my convoys to Haditha. All I knew about Haditha going in was that there was a massacre there. I knew about that one sort of flashpoint. I knew that 24 Hadithans had been killed by our troops, and that was essentially my context for understanding where I was about to embed. I ended up camped on the Euphrates River. Turns out that Feurat over here was named after that river. And sort of like having the mastermind of 9/11 get his entire education in your own backyard, I again was just oblivious to the war right in front of me, which the story of the war, I think a large part of it is sort of symbolized by this river. I was camped on this river. Right across the river was another camp. The camp that they never really wanted me to see while I was over there. It was the camp that was populated by Kellogg Brown Root. Kellogg Brown Root, KBR, is a subsidiary of Dick Cheney's old company, Halliburton. And I got to tell you, the SEALs did a really good job of plotting my embed, making sure that I saw what they wanted me to see. And they wanted me to see victories. The very, very first thing one of the SEALs said to me when I got to Haditha was, we're winning, we're going to win. They showed me their victories. Some of them, you know, as mundane as power lines that they put up, water projects that they were working on. But there was one day where I was on the Euphrates and I was without my military escort. I was without the SEALs. And my Jordanian translator, Rami, he said, you want to see something? I'll show you something if you want to see something. You know, again, I'm Forrest Gump. I wasn't asking to see what I saw. I didn't know what to ask for. I think this guy saw a journalist who didn't know what he was doing. He's like, let's put this guy to use. Let's make him worth his plane ticket. And he said, come on, let's go to the other side of the river. And he took me. He took me to the other side of the Euphrates, behind the camp where Kellogg Brown Root was stationed. And he said, this is a burn pit. And at the time, I did not know how big this story was going to be. I did know, though, it was important to document what I was seeing. If I give myself a pat on the back for anything, when I was over in Iraq, it was that I took pictures. I took a lot of pictures. I took pictures of that burn pit, and the next day, I met a man who lived downstream from that burn pit. And I'd like to just take a quick sidebar into the advice my father gave me before I left Iraq. After I finally was able to get sponsorship to go over there, he told me, okay, if you're going to do this, do it right. Find their story. Everybody's talking about us. We're talking about our casualties, our story, our troops. Find their George Washington, he said. Find their hero. Tell that story. Well, I think my father was sort of sniffing in the right direction, but when he was talking about George Washington, their hero, I sort of took that to mean a military figure, somebody who was engaged in that kind of formal leadership. But when I met the man I'm about to describe to you, I knew in that moment this was the story. It's just taken me a long time to contextualize it, to see it for what it is. And I'm not even sure I still fully see it. But the man's name was Sheikh Dahan Hussein Dumaithan al-Jughayfi. And he definitely did not embody what I thought a sheikh should look like, would be like. I expected wealth. When I heard sheikh, I had an American's assumptions about what a sheikh looked like, about what a sheikh had. This man's story was not what I expected. He sat in front of me with a CIA translator between us, and he told me the story of how he'd gone bankrupt. When I asked him why he'd gone bankrupt, he told me it was because he was paying for the surgeries of his son, the surgeries and the chemotherapies. I believe the number was 25 different chemo sessions because of his son's mysterious cancer. He said he too now had cancer. And I took pictures. I took pictures of the lesions that he showed me on his legs. He lived downstream from the burn pits. His son lived downstream from the burn pits. And they were all now living in the Sheikh's father's house. They were so poor, they were so bankrupted by healthcare costs, that they were all now living in one home in this little town called Barahona, which is part of the Haditha Triad. Now, I'd like to open up this conversation, but before I do, I want to just tell you a little bit about this issue for those of you who aren't familiar with the burn pits. The burn pits were exactly what they sound like. It was a place where, it was a pit right on the Euphrates where we had outsourced through corporations our waste disposal. Our government didn't want to have to pay or have to live up to EPA standards. So we ended up paying KBR to burn our destroyed vehicles, tires, batteries, chemical weapons, and corpses, to name just a few things that were being burned there on the Euphrates. And because of that, we now have our generation's Agent Orange. Because of that, we have our generation's Gulf War syndrome. We have acknowledged this after a fairly long while. There is a senator from my state of North Carolina, Tom Tillis, who's a Republican, and he has worked in a really rare moment of bipartisan legislation with Democrat Amy Klobuchar to acknowledge the burn pit problem, the cancers, the illnesses that have come out of the burn pits, to acknowledge it and to create compensation for soldiers who are exposed. But what I'd like to talk about, and what I think this issue is looks so good about talking about, is not us, but as my father suggested, talk about them. What about the Iraqis? What about the Iraqis who live downstream? What about the Iraqis and their cancer? This is a story that nobody's talking about. We are starting to talk about it. Joe Biden himself thinks his son Beau died as a result of exposure to burn pits. It's a sad story that we've humanized in really American ways. But how might we talk about a story like this, and even more than talk about it, how might we be worth our plane ticket and do something about it? One of the things I'm trying to do, beyond telling the story, is I have a brother who's a clinical researcher at Duke, an oncologist, and he believes he can find the epigenetic signature for burn pit cancers. And he's going to try to do that. We're going to try to work together to figure this out, to get the stories of Iraqis. But as I was talking to Kylie over dinner, now, this is a really complicated enterprise trying to do good. I don't know if that is even good to do that. I don't know if that's where that sort of stands in the methodology of reparations, how to even begin to handle what Rob Nixon calls slow violence. And this is the term that I'd like to use to frame the conversation. Right? Rob Nixon, who was a professor here in Boston at Harvard, he wrote a book called Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor. And just to give a brief excerpt from it, this is what he says. Slow violence refers to the calamities that are slow and long-lasting, calamities that patiently dispense their devastation while remaining outside our flickering attention spans and outside the purview of spectacle-driven corporate media. The insidious workings of slow violence derive largely from the unequal attention given to spectacular and unspectacular time. In an age that venerates instant spectacle, slow violence is deficient in the recognizable special effects that fill movie theaters and boost ratings on TV. So what I'm hoping our panel here tonight might talk about, what we might invite you guys into, is a conversation about how to dramatize slow violence, how to tell the story of Iraqis. Directly to the point of tonight's panel, how to bear witness to the stories of the global war on terror, a war that Mark Redfield, another scholar who right around here, calls phantasmatic. How do we tell these stories? How do we dramatize this war, and how do we do justice to some of these stories that are complicated and involve Iraqis to a degree that is probably really uncomfortable for everybody in this room? I thought maybe we might be able to start with Feurat, if that's at all, if that's okay, because I'd really like to hear you talk a little bit about one of the moves you made as a storyteller. You decided to use cartoon.
Thank you. Yes, I decided to use a tool that I was not familiar with, which is the cartoon or any other way to tell a story. Again, I was in Iraq since 2003 doing my job as a reporter. Telling, of course, the stories of the war, of the daily life of Iraqis, because I had a chance or the opportunity to be, again, in what we call the red zone, being just with Iraqis. I couldn't afford to go to expensive hotels, and so I have spent many months and years with my family. that step by step fled the country. So at the end, I was alone in empty houses, still in the red zone, but being able to talk to Iraqi, to go to the market, to buy my own food, like every Iraqi there. So at that time, I already decided to give a human aspect to the war. Many journalists at that time were really only interested about the militias, for example, or the US Army, or they used to go to places that were blowing up, saying that the account of death, and again figures and things like this, but what was interesting to me is just to go 100 meters of these events and just talking to the people. How do they live during the war? What do they feel? What is it to be Iraqi in Baghdad, for example, during the war? What are the senses that are more developed during the war? What is your story? But then I discovered, especially in France, that there was a kind of fatigue about Iraq and about the war. So I had to struggle to find another way to tell a story. And this is when I came to express all my feelings and giving again an intimate insight of Iraq, using also my memories as a child to put Iraq back into the normal, how can I put it, normal view about the country. So the cartoon is a way using tools that are not meant to be using that way, like Twitter, for example, was another way. Counter-acting or counter narrative of a tool of a story. So this is what I try to do.
Thank you. Ross, there's a point of intersection between our narratives. Ross, of course, his story centers around pollution. And one of the things that's come up in my research on the burn pits is that in pollution, the rate of burn effect right now is 33 times what it is in European cities. That, to me, is one of the mysteries of this war. Where does that come from? Why is that? You tell the story of the sacking of Fallujah from the perspective of the Fallujahs. And I'm curious, what are some of the moves you make as a storyteller to try to combat this fatigue that so many people have on this war?
Well, being a people's history, you relied on interview material, oral histories, things of that sort. Maybe for lack of not having a good answer for you, we have a profile in here of the head pediatrician in the maternity ward at the Feurat Hospital, Dr. Feurat Alani. I read it later too? Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Alani is a middle-aged woman, small, determined, kind, but serious. In June of 2013, she addressed an international audience at the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia, for the Human Rights Defenders Forum. She began with a traditional Islamic greeting, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, and it just grace the Arabic language, translated to peace be upon you with God's mercy and blessing. But then got right to the point. The Iraqi Hiroshima is not a medical puzzle of pedantic interest, nor is it an esoteric question of variables and correlations. It is a war crime committed in the context of an illegal occupation with global governing institutions, which global governing institutions have failed to prevent, retaliate, or punish. She says, ladies and gentlemen, this year, 2013, marks the 10th anniversary of the 2003 Iraq War. Since the invasion, the occupying US and UK-led coalition forces and the Iraqi authorities have failed to fulfill their obligation to protect people's right to life and health, with devastating results from Iraq's people. Grave human rights violations against international law have been reported during the Iraq War. Most of the alleged violations have not been properly investigated, nor have their perpetrators been brought to justice. As a consequence of the use of inhumane, indiscriminate, and toxic weapons, many people have been killed and many are still suffering physical harm without any reparations. Dr. Alani broke from the scientific pretensions of impartiality and urged her audience to look at the data on Fallujah's public health crisis in its human and political context. She implores them to consider what this public health crisis has meant for families in Fallujah. In 2013, 14% of all newborns in Fallujah were born with congenital malformations, 5% of which would die before they reached the age of 1. There is far more writing on these scientific questions than treatment options, and cautionary attitudes about scientific skepticism must be balanced with the urgent need for environmental cleanup and political accountability. This tragedy is not abstract, it is ongoing, and its causes must be studied if something is to be done about it. We met Dr. Alani at the Fallujah Hospital that same year when it was still possible to conduct epidemiological studies or make public health interventions. Before the Iraqi government laid siege to Fallujah again, before the Islamic State arrived, and before the city's entire population was displaced again. In our conversations with Dr. Alani, she brought with her the same balance of scientific skepticism, political awareness, and humanitarian urgency that has characterized her work. At the time of the invasion in 2003, she was working as chief of the pediatrics department at Fallujah Hospital following the sieges of 2004. Dr. Alani oversaw the collection of data on birth defects that occurred in babies born at the hospital. This was a significant intervention, since until that point, no records had been kept in the hospital on cases of birth defects. The health crisis emerged gradually, and it was only once the urgency of the situation became apparent that Dr. Alani took on the responsibility of diagnosing the defects and cataloging the data. But the hardships of life under occupation made it difficult to keep a formal register. This informal data log, consisting only of entries made on her shifts, would later become vital to attracting Western attention and support. Many births went unreported, and a formal register, although still imperfect, was not created until 2009. Given this, it is probable that the rates of birth defects in Fallujah are even higher than has been presented in the scientific literature. Skip ahead. So, the hospital staff are witnessing a range of defects, Dr. Alani tells us, a strange collection, some of which have not been seen by many doctors in the world. But the most common of these, she says, are heart defects. These are often hidden defects that the staff are not able to detect with their limited equipment. Most of the children with such defects die within a year. The health crisis has also affected Dr. Alani's own family. Her brother and sister-in-law had 2 children, both with birth defects. Neither survived. This led Dr. Alani to offer drastic advice. I asked my brother's wife to stop having any more babies until we have a solution. But she is now 33 years old, and I'm not sure when the solution will be available, and if it will ever be available or not. Her advice to all women in Fallujah is the same. I advise them not to fall pregnant, she says. Of course, for many families this is no solution at all, and the implications for the future of the city are dire. But without adequate medical equipment to detect congenital malformations in utero and to treat newborns, and erect a properly funded epidemiological and environmental studies, with no real attempt to decontaminate the city, mothers trying to conceive and bear children run a great risk for their yet unborn children.
Wow.
Good answer.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
Now, do you want to offer an observation?
Yeah, I was just about to ask, how as a scholar do you find yourself deliberately breaking with, as Dr. Alani, convention, such as impartiality to tell these stories or tell your side of the story?
What I liked about Ross's answer is that you asked about how do we dramatize slow violence, is that he didn't answer with himself as the protagonist of the story. It seems like we might be needing to switch the subject and the object of our verbs if we're going to actually hear stories from the right people. So most war stories are stories by men about themselves, even the counter-narrative stories. If we can imagine that every sentence with a transitive verb has a subject, he, a verb, killed, and an object, a person, and we switched the subject and the object of those sentences, we might find that the protagonists of our stories change and that the dramas change as well. So we wouldn't end up telling stories about rapid kinetic violence, or even stories about war. We'd be telling stories about slow violence from the very beginning. So that's the short answer.
And I think an appropriate and uncomfortable one. I find it uncomfortable in a really useful way because I'm telling a story like that, and I mean, I think we need narratives and questions that complicate where we're coming from as writers. So I think maybe an appropriate thing to do right now is to turn the questions over to you guys, as opposed to letting me gabble on here any longer.
Questions from the audience? Anybody have questions for the panelists?
There's an organization called Transforming Violence that I know very little about, but they're committed to using art from people who have survived violence or witnessed violence, and it's based on their experience that somehow to make art is a way to, and they use the word transform, which I'm still wrestling with, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about those two things bumped together, transforming violence.
I'll try. First of all, when I got back from my most recent trip to Iraq, I got it sounds scandalous, but it's not an adult coloring book, which is not, the subject matter is not adult. It's that it's very detailed and it's difficult to stay in the line.
Yes.
It's very satisfying, so there's something there. I think we often think of violence with the he killed someone's
Yes.
Kinetic force idea of what violence is, and that's disruptive violence, which is important to understand. But structural violence is the thing that doesn't look like a rupture. And I think very often, especially many of us in the United States who kind of live out structural violence that gets unseen and unspoken, or might be called slow by people like Rob Nixon, have a lot of difficulty reconciling disruptive violence and structural violence. And perhaps because art breaks the grammar of our thinking and the structure of our cognition from the very get-go, it's exactly the place where those two kinds of violence can converge in a way that is otherwise unspeakable.
Speaking about dramatizing, calls to mind whether not only art but literature can be called into service here. And sometimes it takes a long time, even a generation, to be able to get to the point where something can be rendered in fiction, but when that point happens, it can be quite transformative because it can speak to a very wide audience in quite a universal way. There's a Syrian who lives in London, Zahir Omarin. He's written the book Tales of the Orestes River. He also did an anthology, Syria Speaks, which won the English Pen Award. And he's directly challenging the culture of violence in Syria by writing interlocked stories which mostly show the culture they're in, and all of a sudden, okay, it's a rupture, but for example, the massacre of Hama in 1982, is the basis for his book, Tales of the Orestes River, where he shows normal, healthy family life, and then suddenly they have to cope with this massacre. And but it really brings you into it in a way which is so warm and so enveloping and so empathetic, And sometimes when a culture can get to the point that it can render such horror in fiction, it can actually be more transformative than even just directly dealing with the facts. And I don't know if there's anyone on the panel that wants to respond to that.
I think we had trouble hearing your question.
Oh, sorry.
I got the gist. Can you just sum up in one sentence very loudly? Maybe you can stand up.
Thank you. Sometimes it takes longer, but an approach of actually rendering horror in fiction can give you so much more context and so much more power transformatively. And so I gave this example of Zahir Omarin, who wrote Tales of the Orestes River, about the Hama massacre in Syria in 1982. It's a book of interlocking family stories, and somewhere in there the massacre happens, but it's over there 2 streets away, and you hear this, you see this happens to this relative, but it is in the context of something that is much more fulfilling in a positive way. And by putting it in that context, he's daring to challenge that culture of violence in Syria. I'm wondering if anyone here has anything to say about fictional approaches.
None of us write fiction.
Well, I write
Maybe he writes fiction. There we go.
I write fiction. I could just sort of take a seat of the pants stab at it. I think we have a lot of writers who are very good at that. One of the ones I admire a great deal is Don DeLillo. I met Olivia at a Don DeLillo conference. And I think one of the books where you see that decentering, that dislocating, that really useful dislocating that you're talking about. I think almost every novel DeLillo has written does that. Falling Man does that. Point Omega, when we talk about the global war on terror, does that. But if you ever read Libra, which is his story of the Kennedy assassination, I'm sorry, you don't get the Kennedy assassination in the same back into the left, back into the left, back into the left way you get it with JFK and Oliver Stone's movie. It's a story about Lee Harvey Oswald told largely from his mother's perspective and from the perspective of Nicholas Branch, who is a CIA historian, who is constantly writing this internal history that to this day is still not released. Right? This was one of Trump's imperatives. This is one of his promises that he broke. He said he was going to finally release those JFK files. We always want to see the killing. DeLillo does a great job of challenging what he calls the death-centered narrative. And, Libra's a fantastic place to sort of see a case study in that.
First, Ms. Armstrong,
Yes.
when you had asked, how do we tell the stories of Iraqis, who is the we you're referring to?
I think I meant this room.
That's something that I don't really understand.
Yeah.
I don't really understand why we, as most of us are probably Americans, should or have the responsibility or could possibly do justice to telling the stories of Iraqis. And that's not so much a question, but I'd especially like to hear how the panelists might respond to that. And whose responsibility is it? And as well-meaning Americans, how can we more effectively interact or grapple with this?
It's a really good and comfortable question.
I'm not American.
And so I'd actually be curious then, when you hear that question, as a French Iraqi, how do you feel about that?
You trapped me. No, it's a very difficult question, but the thing is, when I talked to my family in Iraq when I was based there, they used to ask me, what do I think American and also French or European would want to hear about the war. And most of the time, this is something that I try to do while doing my job, even if it's special with me because I'm also Iraqi. But I felt that my family and the Iraqi I've met there wanted to spread the message to the American people. And in a very smart way, I thought that even during the violence, during the war, they knew that a lot of Americans were against the war, and it was very important for them to give another face or story of what was going on in Iraq. So I don't know if that answers your question, but for Iraqis that I've met, it is important.
I would add to that. First of all, I love the question because I think to whatever degree we can comb ourselves out of these narratives, the better. I think that's always been one of the central values of good writing is self-erasure, self-effacement, negative capability. As T.S. Eliot calls it, but I have had not just that Jordanian translator, Rami, ask me to tell a story. I like the bird bits, but I've had Iraqis who are living as refugees in Greensboro at the Quaker College where I teach, Guilford, ask me to tell their story. And when they do, it intersects with my sense of what I feel like I need to do. And I know it probably creates all kinds of discursive problems of its own. I think we all have to just do the best we can to follow our compass, and find ways to tell the stories of people who need their stories told.
About this for a while, probably long before I could articulate it, sort of responsibility to create some sort of platform for Iraqis to speak on their own to American audiences. And I've made some fumbling attempts at this over the years. I don't know if I've ever really done it well. I had tried making a documentary film in 2013, and the initial idea was I was just going to conduct a series of interviews with Iraqi refugees who I had met in Europe, and let that be the story. Let them, basically narrate the story of the sieges of Fallujah. And then, as I was putting it together, I thought about it real hard, and I became convinced that Americans probably just wouldn't watch it. I didn't think they would feel invested in Iraqis telling their stories. So I decided to sort of narrate the documentary as a veteran searching for truth about what he participated in the war. And I think, in a sense, it was more effective like that. I think it drew more attention to the documentary. I also think it stole attention away from Fallujah and put it on me. And I don't know if that was the right decision. It definitely got viewed more. I don't know if it had more of the impact that I hoped it would. So this book was another probably fumbling attempt at trying to create a platform for Iraqis to tell their stories. And now I'm sort of continuing with that with a digital archive project. And one of the problems I keep coming up against is I'm not sure what's in it for them to tell their story. I have nothing to offer them, and I can't lie that I can say I haven't benefited off of doing this work. I have a job doing this, I get paid to do it, and that's uncomfortable. And I have nothing to give back to them, only the promise that I'm trying to do reparations work, poorly as it may be, and I'm not sure I'm making any good on this interchange.
So I'm an anthropologist. My job is to tell other people's stories, which I think is incredibly problematic, but better a bad story than no story at all. Like I even find myself willing to watch Fox News just to know what's going on and not even to read between the lines, if that makes sense. Like I'd rather have bad news than no news, and I'd rather have propaganda than nothing, which is not to say the lesser of two evils is in any way a good alternative, but yes to storytelling for sure. And especially because it seems that it's very important to Iraqi people right now, right? So that's not always true in every political context and among every group of people, but my experience is that the underlying frustration that I found in my work living with people who wanted their story told was that they weren't, just because of the mandate of ethical research, I couldn't name them without using pseudonyms, and that was incredibly frustrating. People want to be named. And I had to oftentimes censor stories or make them more palatable to an English-speaking audience than I wanted to, or that the people I work with wanted to. So, for example, graphic depictions of bloody violence don't actually carry over very well to a particular audience, and that was problematic. So there's a huge gap between a storyteller and the audience, and mediating that gap is incredibly fraught, and it's something we all contend with. But thank goodness there are people doing that work. So I think that we've all found different ways of doing it. And as you can tell, none of us is quite comfortable, and we're continuing to find new ways to do it. But I would just say that storytelling isn't like this noble thing that then accomplishes something. It's supposed to happen in order to mobilize more. And so I would much rather you give money to help us fundraise for the equipment we're delivering to Fallujah Hospital than like go out and tell your friend what you heard tonight. But I'd really love if you did both.
Question for Journalism and Reading Society. I'm sorry, what name? Ross, thank you. I find it interesting when you talk about being a soldier and saying, what I'm doing, this isn't right, this isn't good, I'm uncomfortable, and other soldiers not. And I'm wondering, how much of your identity you feel at that time was built around being a Marine? some of your other members of your school?
Probably not at all. I didn't join for ideological reasons. I joined to sort of like enrich my own identity, right? And it's true, I think other people join the Marine Corps in particular for that remake that is promised in boot camp, right? You go in one person, you come out a totally different person, you can transform your life, prove something to your father, or whatever, whatever it is you want to do. Yeah, I just wanted to look like a tough guy, so. I didn't feel invested in it in the same way everyone else did, and I don't know why I had such a hard time walking away from it. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the project you mentioned earlier, the ISLA project, I think it was?
Yeah, so it's a grassroots reparations project, and I think of it as aid work married with solidarity work. We try to work directly with the Iraqis on their terms. It's fundamentally different from charity, such that charity often just sort of throws money at a problem without investigating the root causes. A lot of times it's just a way for us to feel better about ourselves, throw down $20 and go about your day. This is supposed to be different. It's supposed to be a sustained commitment to this project of social repair. It's supposed to interrogate the root causes of why we should be giving money in the first place. What is our connection to this violence and to their suffering? And it was really hard to do good aid and solidarity work in Iraq because so many NGOs and nonprofits had to sort of enlist themselves in the occupation in order to exist and do work. And it was a moral compromise that I was never comfortable with. And Callie really deserves credit for this framework of grassroots reparations. She came up with all this, and she sold me on it right away. I immediately saw the brilliance of it and its relevance to Iraq because it's not charity, it's not goodwill or good nature, it's a responsibility. So we frame it as such, and we try to, work with the Iraqis in the way that they want us to.
So an example of a project, so it's actually become a platform for people who like the philosophy, and it's not only Iraq focused, but our part of it is. So there are other groups of people that are doing different things within the framework all over the world. But one of the projects it's not a project, one of the relationships we've built over the long term is with the Fallujah Hospital, not just to address the lack of research or the insufficient research on birth defects, but to actually engage in the treatment process for people that the doctors find urgently need support. And that relationship is like 10 years old now at least, and so the nature of that project shifts over time. So right now the question is, what kind of equipment does the hospital need to actually do the research it needs to do? Sometimes it's an emergency case like the one that I described before. So that's one of the strongest relationships that we have in Iraq. And then there are others in other communities in Iraq that are newer or weaker, but that we're building.
I think we're going to call it a night right there. So I want to give our panelists.
Thank you all personally for Ross, Kali, and Matt for your honesty, candor, humility, and your courage, and really your willingness to engage with the difficult questions. Both, sharing your personal story, but also these difficult questions of representation and how we sort of understand conflict and understanding American conflict overseas. So we do have wine, we do have food, but I want to end with one poem by Elham Al-Zubaydi, who's one of our Iraqi female contributors to this issue, and I just wanted to throw some poetry out there into the night because it does end with bread. So it's called A Flute for Sinjar. Oh Nadia, is it possible that even as this wound fades, it will outlive us both? Oh Rihanna, is it possible that the sting of our suffering will be, like so much of ours, erased? Oh Wafa, is it possible that the monster we've made prey upon us drains us of our blood? A myth.
Shall we still fear death while our bodies, their doors and loops are pried open and our braids are loosened, undefended? But Sinjar, Sinjar, is it possible that on Mount Sinjar even the memories of gushing springs dry up? What we've lifted in our hands, touched to our faces, vanishes into the far valley like lost hostages. I do not believe this drought has destroyed every meadow, nor every hearth that bakes our bread, that sustains our dreams. Please eat bread and drink wine.